we're chatting to Dr. Joubert Nolte, National Technical Manager for Ruminants at Meadow Feeds. Welcome, Joubert, and thank you so much for joining us here on Farmers Inside Track.
Hi, Dawn, and good day to all the farmers out there.
Now, before we get into today's topic, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you start in agri? A bit about your journey.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. I was fortunate enough to grow up on a sheep farm in the Karoo, and that's where my roots are. I came to Stellenbosch and I lectured for a while at Elsenburg. And in 2002, I joined private sector, and shortly afterwards, in 2005, I joined Meadow. So I'm part of the furniture at Meadow already.
And you have a wealth of experience also in the industry, so it's so great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, today we're focusing on the dry cows, and you're specifically saying do not forget the dry cows. Can we maybe start about what is the dry period? What is it all about?
Yeah, I think it's important to just qualify what we mean with the dry period. That refers to the period when the one lactation stops, and then there's sort of a resting period before she eats off with the next lactation and start producing milk again. Typically, that's about 60 days in length, but there are variants to that time span.
And why is this period so important? What happens during this time?
Well, the cow works very hard. The modern dairy cows produce 50 or 60 and the top cows 80 liters of milk a day. And at that time, she's also pregnant. So she's also nourishing a fetus. So that's hard work. And then the mammary gland or the udder needs to rest and reset before she starts with the next lactation and starts all over again. And that's how these cows have been modeled. They've been bred to do it. But it does not take away that really work hard, and they need a resting phase, sort of recap and resettle and position themselves properly for the next lactation.
Now, you mentioned briefly just the period, but why does this period matter, and what is the length more or less?
As I briefly referred to already, typically the dry period is about 60 days in length, but there are variants, different options available. So clearly it makes sense from a farmer's point of view if you could shorten that period, because that's the period when the cow does not generate income. So for every day that you can keep her in milk longer, she generates hopefully a profit for you. Research shows that when you go shorter than about 45 days for mature cows, then milk production in the following lactation is negatively impacted. For first lactation cows, they seem to do better at a longer dry period. We try not to keep them dry for shorter than 60 days, but when you go longer than 70 days for any of these cows, milk production in ensuing lactation will be negatively impacted.
And then as I understand it, there's also very two distinct groups of cows when it comes to this. Could you maybe explain the difference, and also what are the nutritional requirements that comes with it?
Quite often, the dry cows are the forgotten cows on the farm because they're not in the milking parlor and they're not seen every day in some cases even. And they're quite often sort of shoved into a back corner of the farm and only brought back a couple of days before they have to calve. But that is wrong. Remember that the cow's lactation actually starts at the beginning of the dry period, because that's the whole preparation period. So we divide these cows into what we call the far-off cows, and that's the cows that have just been dried off. And that's about 30 to 40 days from dry off into the dry period. And then they enter into the steam-up phase or the close-up dry cow period. And we categorize them into these two groups because they have significantly different nutritional requirements. So we have to care for them differently in terms of what we feed them and how we look after them.
Now, if a farmer is listening and wants to understand the best way to treat the cow while they're in this dry period, what are some of the details or aspects that you'd maybe like them to consider or even think about during this dry period?
So let's handle the far-off dry cows first. And remember that the cow was in the milking parlor. So she's been producing 25 or 30 or some cows even 38 liters of milk per day. And then all of a sudden, she's got to stop that without warning, which is a tough ask. She's modeled, she eats the proper food, and then tomorrow morning she is just not coming to the parlor. So the major physiological change that she has to handle in this 30 to 40 days is what we call active involution of the mammary gland. Discontinuing milk evacuation from the udder is the main signal for the cow to stop producing milk. But what happens is, although we stop evacuating the milk from the mammary gland, she keeps on producing milk for about 4 or 5 days afterwards. But then at about 4 to 5 days, she gets the signal that this milk is going nowhere and she has to stop producing it. This is an uncomfortable period for her, and she can sometimes experience a little bit of pain, but we handle that as best we can on farm. But it holds risk, because if she keeps on producing milk and the milk is not evacuated, then obviously pressure in the udder builds up, and with that the teat canals dilute because of the pressure, and that opens the ideal opportunity for bacteria that to enter the mammary gland. So the ladies out there can probably identify with this. You sit with this pressure in the udder and teat canals are dilated. Bacteria can easily penetrate. Secondly, we're not evacuating milk from the udder anymore, so when bacteria enter the udder, we don't take it out. So then they can colonize in the udder and sit there and do whatever bad stuff they want. And the third thing to keep in mind is when the cow is in the milking parlor, whether she's milked 2 or 3 times a day, we disinfect the udders and sanitize the teats every time before and after milking. So we keep the environment around the udder relatively clean. Mm-hmm. And the fourth thing that increases risk for these cows is that the immune system, shortly after dry-off, is preoccupied with taking care of the degenerated milk secretory cells. Okay, so these cells are not working, some of them die off, and she's got to get rid of them. But that's sort of the focus at that stage. And now there's a whole load of bacteria that potentially can enter the udder, and she's sort of not, the immune system can be slow to react, and that can obviously increase the risk for mastitis. And the final point I want to make here is that as she stops producing milk, there are certain, let's call it, natural defense mechanisms. As this pressure builds up in the udder and milk secretion stops, those natural defense mechanisms against these bacteria are only activated around about day 6, 7. So that first week after dry-off is really a high-risk period for the cow, where ugly bugs can enter into the mammary gland and then obviously cause a load of issues for the poor cow.
So monitoring the cows during that first few days is vital for a farmer.
Very. That is key. And once again, quite often we find that once this cow have produced milk, 300 or 350 or 400 days in lactation, and now she's dry and she's got 2 months to get ready for the next lactation. But then we tend to forget about her, shove her off there in a corner. But she is really going through a load of physiological changes with high risk. And if we don't manage this first 25 to 30 days very well, we put her in a muddy place full of bugs, you're going to end up with a cow that has mastitis even before she enters the lactation, the next lactation. And that's going to be negative to the animal and obviously to your bottom line as a farmer. If you do that well and she achieves what we call steady state involution of the mammary gland, then she's reasonably safe. Because what happens here is in steady state, she has gone through the associated anatomical changes to the teat ends. A proper keratin plugs have been formed in the teat canal, so bugs can't go in. Mm-hmm. They're sealed off, as a matter of speech. And the increased antimicrobial secretions in the udder have been optimized. So she's all better positioned to take care. If some bacteria goes into the udder, she is strong and well positioned to take care of it. But the real threat here is that that first 7 to 10 days is key. That is when bacteria can enter the udder, and if we don't feed her well and ensure that she's got a proper and a strong immune system, she's at risk.
Let's focus now on the close-up dry cows. What is this period and why is this so important, and what are the requirements when it comes to this period for a farmer?
So the close-up period refers to the 3 weeks before her next lactation starts. So remember, this is actually what we call where she initiates the transition period, and she actually, although she's not really being milked, she's actually starting to produce milk. So we have to look after her well here. What is important to keep in mind is that these cows go through several transitions. One is the physiological changes from a lactating animal to a dry animal, hormonal changes. But she's pregnant. In the last 2 months of pregnancy, about 70% of the fetal growth takes place. So we have to look after this cow to have a healthy calf. And we want to milk. If it's a heifer, we want to milk that heifer 2 years from now. So the important thing in the 3 weeks prior to calving is that the mammary gland prepares to produce milk, and the secretion of these milk components starts to increase from about 14 days prior to calving. But copious colostrum production actually starts about a couple of days, about 3 days before calving. At this stage, we sit with a cow that is preparing, the mammary gland is preparing to produce milk. About 3 days before calving, it starts to produce milk actively. So once again, you sit with this increased pressure because she's not being milked. She only comes to the parlor after she calved. Once again, you sit with that increased pressure and potential for bacteria to increase, because the pressure can push out those keratin plugs maybe before calving already. In a period when she really needs to eat and look after herself, hormonal changes manages feed intake down. So in this last 3 weeks, she'll eat less and less, and 3 to 5 days before she calves, feed intake can sometimes drop as low as 30 to 40% of what she would eat, 4 weeks ago. So that's the challenge. We are working with a high-producing animal that needs to be kept healthy with a strong immune system, and now she doesn't want to eat. And for us as nutritionists, that is a real challenge to get that cow to eat the food that we place in front of her. And remember that despite this, we also have to transition the digestive system. So she's been on a lactating diet, then she went to a high-fiber, low-density, bulky, far-off diet, and now we transition her again, what we call a steam-up diet. That's sort of an intermediate diet, because a couple of days from now, she's going to be entering the lactation group, and then we have to feed her rocket fuel to get maximum milk out of her. And if we don't transition the digestive system properly, we're going to have problems shortly after she calves.
What is cow comfort for dry cows all about?
In simple terms, when cows are not happy, they just won't perform. And that's probably true for any species. So what we mean when we refer to cow comfort is actually managing the environment where the cow stays so that she is comfortable to have access to good resting space when she needs to rest, but also access to food and access to water. So let's start with what we mean with water. Cows drink a lot of water. First of all is make sure that the water is clean, make sure that there's enough water, so both drinking space and flow of the water, and then don't give them warm water. Ensure that water that flows into the troughs are cold and cool and clean, because we know water intake is directly correlated to feed intake. If they don't drink water, they won't eat, and obviously the consequences then are obvious. So that's the first thing. Make sure that they have easy access to good quality, cold, clean drinking water. And then secondly, we need to provide a well-balanced diet to them and ensure that they have enough what we call bunk space or feed bunk space. So if you push 100 cows into a 10-meter trough bunk space, they just won't eat. The dominant cows will eat, and the rest of the cows will stand and look at them. So it is important to manage the space that you provide. And what typically happens is that as dairies grow bigger and bigger, they're sometimes a little bit slow to ensure that their facilities keep up with the cow numbers. And it's very easy to overstock. But when you overstock, the dominant cows will have proper access to the food, while the other cows will struggle to get to it. And when they do get to it, the dominant cows have probably selected all the proper nutrients out of it and left the less dominant cows with the inferior stuff, because we try to manipulate diets so that cows do not sort the diets. Remember, these diets are not pelleted, so we need that long fiber for rumen health, but they always sort. at least they try their utmost to sort whatever is more palatable. And then the weaker cows in the group will not have access to the proper food.
Seems like a lot goes into the selection of the type of feed, and there's so many elements that goes in terms of the overall well-being and health of this dry cow. Where does this expert knowledge come from? I know you're an expert in your field, but how do farmers really get the support and this kind of support that they need?
Nutrition is a very wide field, and if you ask me to formulate a certain diet for you, I can probably give you 10 options that will analyze identical in terms of protein and fiber levels, etc., etc. But the diets will be different because we can utilize different ingredients to get to that. That's actually just a part of the answer. Qualified and experienced nutritionists need knowledge of a much wider field. We are sometimes challenged with genetic inputs, so you have to have a certain understanding of that. We certainly have to understand the impact of the environment that I just referred to, something like heat stress. I mean, we can talk for a day about heat stress and the impact of that. And while I'm touching on that, I need to bring this up. Because dry cows are not producing milk, in many cases, when they exit the parlor, they're not cared for very well. And they put in a pen somewhere and they stand in the sun and it's hot and it's uncomfortable for them. So when cows are hot, they obviously don't want to lie down and rest. They don't eat well and they don't drink well. It is important to look after these cows very well, and if you can, supply shade to them and cool them down. Recently, a lot of research have been conducted in this field, and we've seen that dry cows that are subjected to heat stress not only produce less milk in the ensuing lactation, but they also have in utero heat stress that impacts on the production of their calves. So if they have heifer calves that come into lactation 2 years from the date when they're born, they will also produce less milk, have a weaker immune system, because that heat stress impacts on the exchange of nutrients and oxygen across the placenta. So very important to not forget about them, but look after them very well. They are late pregnant, and the way you treat them in this dry period will have an impact on how those cows perform in the ensuing lactation, but also what their female progeny will do in their lifetime production.
Let's talk about the feeding of dry cows. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Remember in the first episode we touched on nutrition, but nutrition is a very wide field. So it's not only about the nutrients, but it's also about managing the intestinal tract of the cow so that it's healthy. It's a very large, let's call it, it's not one organ, but let's call it, it's a large chunk of what happens inside the cow. And we have to ensure that the intestinal tract is in a good condition. So this period is a phase for us where we have 60 days where you could feed the cow a lower density diet so that possible damage that she incurred during the previous lactation can be repaired in the digestive tract. Then you also focus on fiber levels, and not only fiber but the different components of fiber, how much NDF and ADF and those fractions that we look at we want in the diet, because the fiber content of the diet impact on the rumen motility. So there we want to feed coarse fiber, if I can put it that way, and get enough of them into the cow so that the rumen can work and sort of repair muscle tone. A big challenge to us, because margins are so thin in the dairy business, especially at the moment, we really try and feed these cows for the 2 months when they're not producing milk as cheaply as possible. But we can't feed them an inferior diet. When you increase the bulkiness of the diet, you still have to focus on palatability so that you ensure you achieve dry matter intake targets. Why is dry matter intake important for us? It is important because we know that, especially in the steam-up phase, dry matter intake in the 3 weeks prior to calving is correlated to dry matter intake after calving. And post-calving, it's important to keep in mind that if she eats better and she eats more, she'll produce more milk. Because of that correlation, we really focus on balancing all the nutrients with the costs and achieve the dry matter intake targets. It's also important to remember that the best time to ensure that the cow calves in the right condition is to manage that actually is in the late lactating period. Why? Because she's still producing milk and you're earning an income from her. When she's dried off, it's just a cost. So if you have to repair damage in a phase when she's not generating income, it can be very expensive. You also sit with the challenge that the fetus grow at about 70% or more in that last 2 months. So if you push nutrients too hard, you can have calving problems with calves that are too big at calving, and you can imagine what problems flow from that. The final point I want to make here is that any nutritionist can formulate a load of different diets, but we try to work with what is readily available in a certain area because of cost. We have to be wary of cost always, but we have to do what is right for the cow because this is the preparation for the next lactation.
I think the most important thing that I want to maybe highlight as we wrap up and go more to our closing points is that there's always the importance of finding a balance. It's not just about making your profit at the end of the day. You need to take care of your animals. With expert advice, it's important to listen and to learn and to practice the best way possible to keep a healthy cow.
I think that's sort of the bottom line. If you look after your animals and you ensure that they're happy and well looked after, they look after you. Care for them and then the rest will sort of happen. As a farmer, you always have to look at cost. And that's your mandate, to manage your business, but not at the expense of the animals that you care for.
I think that's a very important point. And then as we're closing off, what are the other aspects that farmers should really be looking at, considering everything that you've spoken about, and also looking to the next discussion that I think Vienna will also be joining us for the rest of the campaign?
We've discussed a lot of things, and I'm going to try and wrap this up in a couple of bullet points, if I could put it that way. So firstly, remember that the cow, once she exits lactation and she's dried, she goes through a number of physiological changes. That is high risk. First of all, she needs to stop lactation. Then she needs to be in a steady state. And then she really starts lactation again, all in about 60 days. So the mammary gland has to be remodeled, if I can put it that way. But at the same time, we also have to manage and transition the digestive system from a high-density lactating diet to a high-fiber, low-density diet, and then into a transition diet and back to a lactation diet. And don't forget that calving is the most stressful event in the cow's life. This in itself is a high-risk period. So we really try and focus on positioning the cow so that she calves down in the right condition with a strong immune system so that we can position her to battle all the bacteria and bad events that could take place in that period. Then I've referred to this a couple of minutes ago, but you have to ensure that the cows are dried in the right condition. Manage them in the last 60 to 90 days of their lactation period to achieve a condition score of 3.3 to 3.5 when you turn them dry. If they're too thin, risk for metabolic issues are low, but they just won't peak. So thin cows don't milk. If they're too fat, you run high risk of metabolic issues in that 3-4 weeks immediately post-calving, and then they also won't milk. But if you can get them to calve down in the right condition and you hit the targets of dry matter intake with the right nutrients pre-calving and immediately post-calving, you've got a healthy cow with a strong immune system that will milk well and peak well at about 60 to 80 days in milk. And then if she peaks well, she's set for the whole lactation and she'll produce well. Finally, I need to say that a couple of objectives are that you have to manage the environment properly. Make sure that she's comfortable, she's got access to good food, good water, quality resting place and shade, optimize dry matter intake of a well-balanced diet, not only in terms of nutrient composition, but also in how the diet is prepared and presented, and in terms of palatability. Do everything you can. Make sure she's got a strong immune system and minimize every single thing you can think of that could be a stress factor to her. And finally, remember that the lactation actually starts when you turn the cow dry. not when she calves.
Thank you so much, Joubert Nolte. I think it's always great chatting to you on Farmers Inside Track. You have so much knowledge to share, and I'm sure the aspiring dairy farmers out there and the existing ones have a lot of checks and balances to do. So thank you so much, and looking forward to having you with us again.
Thank you. All the best.